Chapter 5. The next morning they met in the front of the school before the first bus showed up. There were only a couple of cars in the teacher's parking lot. "I hope Mrs. Waters isn't late today," Josh said as they entered the school. "We need to get those notes in the mailboxes before the teachers get here." They hurried along the silent hallway to the principal's office. Mrs. Waters was taking off her coat. "Mr. Dillon isn't in yet," she said when the kids walked in. "We came to see you," Dink said. "Well, isn't that nice?" the secretary said, flipping a page on her calendar. "Goodness, where did March go already? Now, how can I help you, kids?" Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose explained their idea. "You honestly think one of our teachers took the skeleton?" she asked. "We don't know," Dink said, "but the footprints look like an adult's. Would you mind putting these in the right mailboxes?" He handed Mrs. Waters the 8 notes they'd printed. She read one and smiled. "Of course I will," she said. "And I wish you luck in finding Mr. Bones. I know Mr. Dillon would be happy to have this mystery solved." Mrs. Waters stood up, walked to the teacher's mailboxes, and placed the notes in 8 different slots. The kids thanked her and left. Just then the bell rang, and the students began rushing through the front door. They walked to their room and found Mrs. Eagle at her desk. My, look who's eager to get started," she said. Once more, the kids explained that the footprint, the 8 notes, their plan for finding the person who took the school skeleton. They showed her Josh's drawing of the footprint. "And you plan to ask each teacher if you can measure his or her foot?" Mrs. Eagle asked, grinning. "That footprint is our only clue," Ruth Rose said. "We want our class to win the tickets," Josh said. Mrs. Eagle smiled. "All right. If the teachers agree, you 3 may leave the room later," she said. The morning seemed to last forever. Dink kept glancing at the clock, and Josh kept sighing and fidgeting at his desk. Finally, during math, a 5th grader came into the room and handed Mrs. Eagle a stack of papers. She looked through the stack, then called Dink up to her desk. "Here are your responses," she whispered. "All 8 have checked yes. You might as well go now, and good luck." Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose quietly left the room. They brought with them 8 sheets of drawing paper, a ruler, Josh's footprint sketch, and Ruth Rose's list of teachers' names. "Guys, I just thought of something," Ruth Rose said in the hallway. "Whoever made that footprint yesterday might be wearing different shoes today." "You're right," Dink said. "So anyone whose shoe is about the right size will ask if they wore the same shoes yesterday." They started walking down a hall. On one classroom door, someone had hung a sign. It said, "Come home, Mr. Bones, we miss you." There was a drawing of a skeleton under the words. 3 girls wearing skeleton masks scampered down the hall. "Mr. Bones, where are you?" one of the girls said. The other 2 laughed at their friend. Outside the 5th grade room, a paper skeleton hung from the ceiling. "The whole school is looking for Mr. Skeleton," Josh muttered. "We have to find it first." "Then we'd better get going," Ruth Rose said. "Maybe no one else knows about the footprint yet." First on her list was Miss Alubicki, the kindergarten teacher. They showed her Josh's drawing and asked if she would let them trace her left foot. "Of course," Miss Alubicki said, smiling. "But I can already tell you that that footprint is a lot bigger than mine." The little kids giggled as Josh traced around her foot on a piece of paper. Outside in the hall, Josh compared it to his drawing. "It's definitely not her," he said. "Miss Alubicki's foot is only 7 inches long." Ruth Rose drew a big X in the front of Miss Alubicki's name on her list. After the name, she wrote, "Too small." They went next door and peeked into Mr. Diodato's 1st grade class. The tall teacher was writing on the chalkboard, "Who stole the school skeleton?" Dink knocked, and Mr. Diodato looked up. "We have visitors, class," he said, grinning. While Josh traced Mr. D's sneaker onto a sheet of paper, the 1st graders gathered round. Dink, Josh, and Ruth Rose thanked Mr. D and left. In the hall, Josh measured what he had traced onto the paper. Mr. Diodato's sneaker was almost 13 inches long. The bottom tread had little squares, not zigzags. "Cross him off too," Dink said. Ruth Rose put an X by Mr. Diodato's name and wrote "Too big." 6 more names to go, Josh said. Glancing at Ruth Rose's list, What if it's none of them? It must be someone on this list, Dink said. How could a stranger sneak into the school and walk out with a skeleton? One by one, the kids traced the teacher's shoes onto paper and measured them. They compared the tracings with Josh's drawing. One by one, Ruth Rose put X's next to the names. With only one more name to go, Ruth Rose's list looked like this. Kindergarten, Miss Alubicki, too small. First grade, Mr. Diodato, too big. Second grade, Miss Crumpet, too small. Third grade, Mrs. Eagle, too small. Fourth grade, Mr. Quattro, absent Monday. Fifth grade, Mrs. Golden, too small. Principal, Mr. Dillon, was wearing loafers Monday. Secretary, Mrs. Waters, too small. Nurse, Miss Shotsky, too small. Art teacher, Mr. Love, too big. Music teacher, Miss Aria, too small. Janitor, Mr. Neater, way too big. Gem teacher, Mr. Palmer. Not one of these people made that footprint, Ruth Rose said. Who's the last name? Dink asked. Mr. Palmer, the gem teacher, she answered. Josh crossed his fingers. Maybe he's the one, he said. They found Mr. Palmer sitting behind his desk. He smiled when the kids walked into the office. I read your note, he said. Thanks for seeing us, Josh said. Dink said, May we measure your shoes? Mr. Palmer grinned. But I guarantee I didn't steal that skeleton yesterday morning. I was in the emergency room at the hospital. He stood up and held out his left foot. There was a white cast on it. I slipped on some ice yesterday getting into my car yesterday, he said. He pointed to a pair of crutches leaning in the corner. I can hardly carry my lunch, let alone a skeleton.